The conversation continues tonight as we continue our 2020 focus on the push for equality. As the events surrounding race relations have emerged this summer, beginning with the death of George Floyd, a new concept has emerged: white fragility. It's the idea that whites simply can't talk about race. Taken further, the woman behind the idea says it's because whites have created a system to maintain white advantage.
White fragility is not weakness per se. In fact, it is a powerful means of white racial control and the protection of white advantage.
Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, shot to the top of bestseller lists as African Americans cried out for racial justice and took to the streets during the summer of 2020. And while they marched, White Fragility sought to explain the root of the problem, calling racism a system and not an event, a system white people use to maintain the status quo even though they don't want to admit it. Consider, for instance, a workplace seminar on racial sensitivity. Whites will often say, "I'm colorblind. I judge people by their character and not the color of their skin. I don't care if a person is white, black, purple, or polka dotted. My best friend is black. I marched in the 60s. According to DiAngelo, none of that matters. If you are white, you are still racist.
I believe that white progressives cause the most daily damage to people of color.
Whites, she argues, want to take race off the table in order to be comfortable with our racism because of the internalized superiority of whites.
But one of them is that we really are taught not to see this. So if you're a person of color scratching your head thinking, how can they not see this? Like, I just don't believe they don't see this. We actually really don't see it. Oh, and hell yes, we know it. And we do see it, but we cannot admit that.
The book diminishes black people in the name of dignifying us, counters John McWhorter, a Columbia professor writing in The Atlantic, who says the book has obvious flaws. While DiAngelo criticizes whites for avoiding blackness by using such terms as urban, underprivileged, diverse, or bad neighborhood, McWhorter points out, call it a black neighborhood, and you're a racist. By DiAngelo's logic, he says, you are not to describe such neighborhoods at all, even in your own head.
So Robin DiAngelo says it doesn't matter if you have friends that are black or if you think that you are colorblind. None of those things matter. You're still a racist. And I think that that's what whites find objectionable to this book and this concept.
And I agree. I mean,
the difficulty of defining the right and wrong of white fragility isn't lost on Melinda Whitlow, a doctor of nursing practice at UVA who participated in a white fragility study group this summer, where answers did not come easily.
You know, she also says this is on a continuum, that it's something that will probably never end as far as racism. And so a lot of us reading the book wanted to know, well, how do you do that? And we couldn't find the answers.
While there are clearly issues that need to be addressed, and racism is not a pleasant topic for most, Whitlow says the book does move the needle.
You would be more likely then to call attention to someone making a racist comment now, whether they meant it or didn't mean it. You would take the time to point it out now.
Yes, in a way that was constructive, not demeaning.
So, while DiAngelo says whites just can't help but be racist, so they should just stop being defensive, and the book's detractors, like McWhorter, say DiAngelo has white Americans muzzled, straitjacketed, tied down, and chloroformed for good measure, people like Whitlow just want to find solutions.
I guess it's more of them, what are you doing to not be a racist? It's one thing that you're surrounded by diversity, which is great, but what are you doing beyond that to help stop racism on that continuum?
The conversation continues tonight as we continue our 2020 focus on the push for equality. As race relations have taken center stage this summer, beginning with the death of George Floyd, young people are making sure their voices are heard.
2020 has been a year of change for many college students, including Tanija Rivera, starting her junior year virtually in Roanoke instead of on campus at Howard University. But far more has changed her this year than just COVID.
I feel the fire in my chest and how much I want to make that change.
In the wake of George Floyd's death, Tanija has turned her anger into activism, taking to the streets to protest and using her voice to make a difference.
We've dealt with a lot of racial injustice and inequality, and then the overall socioeconomic inequality within our minority communities that have allowed us to fall a lot further than we ever should have been. But we're doing the best that we can, and right now is a time that we're not going to give up.
As our 2020 focus on the push for equality continues, we're taking you to Allegheny County, where the only African-American community is about to undergo a rebirth. 10 News anchor Lindsay Ward sat down with community members from Wrightsville to see where they've been and where they're going.
In the 1960s, the government used eminent domain to take a large portion of Allegheny County's only African-American community to build Interstate 64. It forced homeowners like Liz Jordan's parents to move their house.
I can remember when they moved 2 homes. They put them on a truck and moved them from where I-64 sits now.
So if you've ever traveled on I-64 through Covington, you've driven on the land that was once part of Wrightsville. This map hanging inside the neighborhood museum shows just how large the community used to be. What's left? Where are we now?
This is where we are now.
Right here. Okay.
This is where we are.
That small triangle.
Yes. Yes.
What's left now sits off a busy Route 220.
We are small, but we're big in heart.
And on the hearts of families left in Wrightsville, the hope of sprucing up their historic neighborhood.
The road to restoring Wrightsville started several years ago with a community conversation. Neighbors coming together, reminiscing how things used to be and used to look.
So we were like, what can we do to spruce our little community up?
I went to our representative. I was like, hey, you know, our community is rural and rustic. It could use some improvements for infrastructure and housing.
They secured a grant to preserve Wrightsville's rich history. Archie and Mary Wright founded the community in 1867 after Archie's owner gave him freedom from slavery on a nearby farm.
He worked, saved his money, purchased a parcel of land. As he would purchase land, he would sell land. Purchase, sell. And that's how Wrightsville came to be.
Dr. Calvin McClinton is the great-grandson of the founders.
People found that history of my past exciting and said, why aren't you have legacy. Why aren't you doing something with that? And I'm like, who wants to know anything about that? It's just history is boring.
Taking their advice, he started an annual festival in Wrightsville, celebrating the contributions of African Americans. But still, the community realized Wrightsville needed updating. However, change was on the way. In 2019, Wrightsville was awarded $1.4 million, the largest amount given to any project.
I think there's a sowing season in your life, and then there's a harvest season. And I think at this point, it's harvest time for Wrightsville.
Their harvest season comes in 2020, when the nation has watched the fight against racial inequalities play out on their screens, something not lost on Dr. McClinton.
I think it's interesting that all of this is coming to a head at the same time.
He hopes the hard work and success of Wrightsville leaders will serve as an example to similar communities.
It's really important for us to listen, to come up with a plan, and then put it into action, not to just gripe. I don't have this, I don't have that, they're doing this to me, I can't get that. But stop and say, all right, so there are these inequalities. How can I change that? What do I need to do to change, to make that change actionable?
While they preserve the past, they look to the future and all that will be after work is complete.
I see it as a place that actually potentially, in my mind, to be a tourist location.
I'm looking forward to when people can come and say, wow, I did not know this was.
As a nation, the reckoning on race has led to major changes and brought renewed attention to the ways systems and institutions disadvantage people of color. WSLS 10 News has been dedicated to highlighting these issues as a part of our 2020 focus, A Push for Equality. McKinley Strother breaks down tonight's focus, racism as a public health crisis.
For many, COVID-19 is the worst health crisis in a generation. But that same crisis is shedding light on another emergency, one ignored for centuries: racism.
There are fears and concerns that those of us that come from marginalized communities have that our brothers and sisters on the other side don't think about.
The killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others birthed a movement unlike any other across the country. It opened their eyes to what so many have been saying for years as thousands flooded the street with their cries, their pleas. Ralph Northam signed an executive order creating a commission to examine racial inequality in Virginia law, many that have been in place since the Jim Crow era. At the same time, the coronavirus pandemic brought new light to certain inequalities like housing, jobs, and accessibility.
We talked about that very issue, that racism is a health crisis issue, and we're looking at a proclamation. So that starts with leadership and a message that comes out from the governor and other individuals. So it's something that I'm discussing with that advisory board, and I'll work with Delegate Aird, and I think you'll see more happening in that regard.
As our 2020 focus, the push for equality continues, we're taking a look at your voting rights and some of the targeted attacks meant to keep voters away from the polls. Advocacy groups say voter suppression efforts have increased since 2008, but the history of restricting the vote can be traced to our country's earliest days. In the presence of a man who fought to secure every American's right to vote.
Your voting rights is one of the most important things that you have.
Brenda Hale, president of the Roanoke chapter of the NAACP, can tell you the work to protect that right is far from over.
If you just think about it, why are there so many efforts to suppress it if it was not important?
Voter suppression is defined as strategies, legal or illegal, to prevent eligible voters from voting or registering to vote, efforts that have disenfranchised Virginia voters from the state's founding days.
You only had to be four things to vote. You had to be adult, white, male, and the owner of a substantial farm.
The fight to protect your right to vote plays out in courts across the country. It's also happening with elected leaders.
Probably one of the most important things that we can do is to make sure that there is appropriate legislation that addresses these types of tactics.
It's work the NAACP has been doing for more than 100 years.
As far as voter suppression, as far as people trying to intimidate you, we will not tolerate that. And we will call on whoever we have to call on if we detect something like that is going on.
Because they say so much is at stake with every election.
We can't give up because we stand on the shoulders of all our ancestors that fought for us, they bled, and they did the ultimate sacrifice. They lost their life so we could have that right.
And in addition to registering people to vote, the Roanoke chapter of the NAACP is working to make sure people have transportation to get to the polls for early voting or on Election Day.